Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're here because today's episode is a doozy. Today, I have 3 stories that nearly shattered everyone involved as they tried to rationalize what happened to them. Just wait until you hear what you're about to hear. So, if you're enjoying the channel, don't be invisible. Let us know you're out there and smash that subscribe button so we can always be together. Thanks. Now, let's get into the stories. Mount Rainier National Park, July 2018. The summer between my junior and senior year of college, I took a road trip with a few of my best friends. We planned a route around the western United States, camping and hiking in the national parks. We were all from the East Coast, so it was an awesome trip overall, getting to spend time out west. Towards the end of July, we went up to Mount Rainier National Park. We planned to spend a week there, camping inside the park each night. We had purposely chosen a spot at the far end of the campsite, away from the other campers. We tended to occasionally get loud, so we tried not to annoy other people if we could help it. Luckily, our stop was fairly isolated from other campers. The first 2 days and nights went fine. We hiked different trails during the day, and then we came back to the campground, made dinner, and sat around the fire. We would hang out, talking, but generally turned in early enough that we could get up and hike first thing in the morning. By this point, we had a solid routine going. The third night, we all settled into our tents at around 10 or so. At some point that night, I was woken up by a horrific sound. Something like a cross between a howl and a groan. It sounded like an animal dying horribly. My friend woke up too. We sat up, stared at each other while listening again for the sound. And it came again, 2 more times before it stopped. We slowly made our way out of the tent to see if our other friends had woken up. They had too. We all grabbed our flashlights and stood around waiting to see if anything else would happen. We all had our guesses as to what we heard. My best guess was a coyote or a fox, but the others insisted it was a bear or even a wild boar. But basically, we had absolutely no idea. It wasn't a noise any of us had heard before. Our food was packed away in a cooler in the car. We'd been doing this all summer and we weren't stupid, but we were still worried about something ransacking our tents. We had had a few close calls at other parks that summer, so we were being very careful. We waited outside our tents for maybe 20 more minutes, but didn't hear that horrible sound again. So we all gave up and went back into our tents. The next morning, after we were all dressed and ready to hit the trails, our one friend yelled for us to come over to where he was standing. He was standing in the woods about 20 feet from the campsite. When we got to him, we saw why he called us over. There were 5 giant footprints in the mud, leading off into the trees. Each one was about twice as long as one of our footprints, but it wasn't a shoe print. It had claw marks at the end. We took some pictures, planning to stop in the park office later that day to see if they knew what it was. It seemed too large for a bear, but we had no idea what else it could be. One of the guys even half-jokingly said it was a Bigfoot. Of course, we all laughed that off, but I think we were all silently freaking out that something with that big of a foot had been so close to our tents without us even knowing. We did stop in the park office and showed a ranger the pictures, and the guy promised to look into it, but he did not seem very concerned. He did warn us about bears and reminded us to lock up food and carry bear spray if we could. It wasn't really very helpful. That night we hung out by the fire again, but we were much more subdued than in the past days. We were all half listening for that strange noise again, or anything out of the ordinary for that matter. That night I didn't sleep well. I was worried about falling dead asleep and being attacked by a giant bear. Nothing happened though, not even the sounds. Thinking that it was a fluke, we got up the next morning and got ready for day 4 of our time in the park. Having done the major trails already, we ended up on a smaller, less trafficked trail. Usually we saw tons of other hikers, but this one was deserted. A few hours in, we stopped for a lunch break. We had spotted a nice big rock off the trail and decided to rest on top of it while we ate our sandwiches. While we sat eating, we didn't talk a whole lot. That's why it was so obvious. We all heard the animal, or what we thought was an animal. It came ambling towards us, occasionally making sounds as it walked. We sat still, waiting for it to get closer and see what it was. It crossed my mind that it could be our campsite bear, but we were pretty far from that site, and because we were up on the rock, we had a good vantage point. When the animal came closer, we could see down right onto the top of its head. I'm not even sure if it knew we were there. We watched as it pushed through some thick evergreen trees, and we saw all 8 feet of it, walking upright. We froze, watching as this giant, hairy creature walked through the trees, no more than 15 feet away from us. Amazingly, it never did seem to see us up on top of the rock. We all stayed completely still and totally silent, although we exchanged looks to make sure we were all seeing it. We couldn't see its features clearly, just glimpses of mounds of dark hair, and then it disappeared. Minutes later, the noises faded too. We waited another 10 minutes before we dared to talk, trying to figure out what we had just seen. I was ready to believe that it was somebody just messing with us, more so than an actual Bigfoot. But it definitely was not a bear. I knew that. We were too stunned to do anything right then. We hiked back to our campsite where we were going to decide what to do next. However, right away I stumbled onto a coyote, and it was absolutely ripped to shreds in the brush right behind our tents. I pointed it out to everybody, and we all agreed we needed to leave right away. We didn't even talk. We just packed up and hightailed it out of the park that night, and we stayed at a cheap motel. We never talked about what we saw with anybody. We basically had no proof, and we figured that nobody would believe us anyway. But there was absolutely something unnatural in that park, something we couldn't explain, and we all saw it. At least we all have each other to talk it through with, if we ever need to. North Cascades National Park, 2018. I had always been fascinated by the great outdoors, spending most of my weekends exploring national parks and hiking trails. So, when I heard about a lesser-visited national park in the Pacific Northwest, one that was rumored to be home to an unknown creature, I knew I had to investigate. My name is Jack, and I'm a wildlife photographer with a passion for capturing rare and elusive animals on camera. I live in Washington State and had heard stories about a creature that resembled a Sasquatch living in North Cascades National Park, but I always thought it was just a myth, a local legend. However, I decided to take a chance and see if there was any truth to the rumors. I spent several days preparing for my trip out to the park. I researched the area, read up on local folklore, and I studied maps to find the most promising spots for wildlife and other sightings. I also made sure to pack all the necessary equipment for my adventure, including my camera, binoculars, and camping gear. As I arrived at the park late on a Friday night, I could feel a sense of excitement building within me. I was eager to explore the beautiful wilderness and hopefully capture photos of rare and unique animals, some maybe that I had never even seen before. I started my hike early in the morning, taking the trail that led deep into the heart of the park. The first few hours of my hike were uneventful, and I was beginning to feel a little disappointed. However, as I approached a clearing, I noticed some interesting movement in the distance. At first, I thought I was about to encounter a bear, but as I got closer, I realized that it was not a bear at all. It was this massive, hairy creature, standing at least 8 feet tall with broad shoulders and long, muscular arms. Its face was covered in hair, and its eyes were deep-set and piercing. The creature seemed to just be as surprised as I was to come across it, and we stood there as the world seemed to stand still, as we stared at each other in silence. The creature eventually then let out a low growl, but it never broke its gaze from me, and that's when I realized that I needed to act fast. I slowly reached for my camera, hoping to capture a photo of it before anything happened, even though at the time I wasn't letting myself think of a worst-case scenario. I snapped a few pictures, and the action of it seemed to really get the creature thinking. It then squinted harder at me and began to move towards me. It was incredibly fast for its size, and I knew I had to move now if I wanted to avoid an encounter. I turned and I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding between my ears. I could sense that the creature was close behind me, but I managed to make it back to my car and jump inside to safety. I locked the doors and I turned on the car without even looking back. I was even able to drive away before anything bad happened. I drove home in this weird trance-like state, almost like my brain couldn't compute what had just happened, and it had shut down on me. Luckily, I did get home and then fell right to sleep. In the morning, it all seemed like a dream. I could barely believe what I remembered happening. And then I remembered my camera. And then while reviewing my photos, I slowly grew terrified as I realized the true magnitude of what had happened, what I had witnessed. The Sasquatch creature was real, and I had managed to capture proof of its existence. Now I'm just working up the courage to share what I found. It still sort of scares me. Although the encounter was scary and overwhelming, at the same time I also feel strangely like it's an experience that I cherish. Basically, it reminded me of the true magic and mystery that lies within nature, and I got to witness some of that firsthand. Now, I just need to feel completely safe before I can take any further chances with what I know. Stamford, Connecticut, February 2016. When I hear myself say it out loud, sometimes even I can't believe it. It sounds so implausible, so far-fetched, but I can't help what I saw, and I think it's almost a duty to let people know. At least make them stay on their guard, to think twice about walking alone or to make sure they travel in groups. It's good advice anyway, but even more now so. If I could at all avoid it, I always tried not to take the last train. Not that the train itself was a problem. They were generally clean and well maintained, and at that time of night, around 11:30, there was virtually nobody on it. The problem was once you got off. Like most people in my town, I commute every day into the city, and then I return every night, happy to get away from the congestion and pollution of the city. In total, the journey to the city by train takes about 40 minutes, which if you add on getting to and from the station, it's about an hour total. But that isn't too much once you're used to it. The only problem is that if you find yourself late in the city, you have to make sure that you're at the station in time to catch the last train. Then if you manage to catch it, you'll still be faced with a lonely walk home at the other end of it, since the buses are no longer running. So, tonight was that night. I stepped off the train onto the platform and I called goodnight to the ticket collector. I don't know his name, but I see him 5 nights out of 7. As soon as I stepped off the train and onto the freezing station, I felt the change. The train itself was brightly lit, and though completely deserted other than one other passenger, it felt like it had life in it. By contrast, the station in the winter, especially at night, feels dead and desolate. There are a few strategically placed lights, but your eyes inevitably need a moment to adjust. And then my walk home involves strolling out of the station, along the platform, and past the tunnel at the end, turning right through the gate and then taking a 10 or 15-minute walk uphill. That night, I didn't even reach the gate. Because of the odd location of my hometown, the last train would pull into the station, and then, rather than continuing along the track in the same direction, it would terminate its service here, reverse, and travel back along the same route it had just taken, heading back to the city. As a result, the tunnel at the end of the tracks through which the train went during the day was dark, On most days, I simply walked past the tunnel without a second thought, turning towards home right before I reached it. Only that night, when I heard the sound, I noticed for the first time the strange divide that the tunnel created, how the light from the lamps illuminated the tracks up until a certain point. But once it reached the threshold of the tunnel, the point where you enter, the light basically stopped, almost like a border. And after that, there was new situation, one that was filled with darkness. The reason I glanced at the tunnel was the sound, a low, guttural curdling, something from within the tunnel, within the blackness, growled. I stopped dead. For a moment I thought it might be a stray dog, that the sound was simply amplified by the echoes caused by the shape of the tunnel. But when I heard it a second time, I knew. That sound wasn't distorted. It was something huge. If it was growling, I thought then clearly it had seen me. I tried to tiptoe to move as quietly and slowly as I could towards the gate. If only I could make it to the gate. I fixed my eyes on the tunnel in the line that separated the light from the darkness, and I watched in horror as one massive paw emerged from the blackness. I ran. Flinging back the gate and dropping my shopping bag, I sprinted up the hill as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding and my breath was catching in my throat until I rounded the corner at the top, and then freewheeling downwards, never looking back. The paw itself had scared me, sure, but more than that, it was the shape. The fact that it wasn't like a bear's paw or even a dog's, but rather it seemed like some stretched, fur-covered bastardization of a human foot. The only difference as being its massive size, the canine backwards bend and the long arching talons that clawed out from each toe. Once home, I called the station in the city to tell them about the tunnel and to inform them of what I saw. They tried as best as they could to reassure me, but I could hear the disbelief and the weariness in their voices. Next, I tried calling the police, and I got a similar response. The following day, I checked every news channel before going down to the station, terrified that I might be met with stories of somebody being maimed or killed by some wild animal. Luckily, when I got there, all was okay. But even in the daylight, the tunnel looked imposing and swallowed the light like it was some massive mouth. I was looking into it when the man at the ticket booth called to me and asked me to come into the back. He told me that he had received a call early in the morning from the city, telling him about my call and asking him to check it out. He said that they had been laughing and they found the whole thing ridiculous. But he, standing on the platform in the early morning when the sun hadn't yet come up, felt the story could really be true. Rather than hopping onto the tracks to take a look, or heaven forbid going into the tunnel itself, he had instead wound back the security camera footage from the previous night. And now he was calling me into the booth to show me what he had seen. On the screen, I saw a grainy image of the platform and the tunnel, and of myself walking along it, pausing, and then running at full speed from the station and out of shot. The angle showed nothing from inside the tunnel. I was about to ask about it when the man raised his hand, indicating for me to wait, which I did. After about a minute, I saw it. A great, hulking mass, like a dog, standing on its hind legs but with its bones and spine refashioned to resemble those of a man. The thing stood on two legs. Its head reminded me of pictures I had seen of wolves, the ears permanently standing to attention, and the lower jaw hanging slightly open. The image was indistinct and blurry, but it was clear just from the scale that this thing was far bigger than a man. The booth operator stared at me and told me that he had already arranged for the tape to be sent to the station in the city, to the train company headquarters, and to the police. That was 3 months ago, though I've called numerous times, arranged meetings with staff members, and even inquired with the police. There is no record of that tape. The booth operator swears it was sent to the city and to the head office. The day after that sighting, I changed my shift pattern at work. I no longer take the last train home. ever.